The morning sun broke across the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943, painting long shadows that stretched toward the emerald waters of the South Pacific. In the next 17 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy would experience the most devastating personal loss of the entire Pacific War. 6 carefully chosen Zero pilots, each selected for exceptional skill and entrusted with the highest honor their careers could offer, were about to face the most catastrophic failure in Japanese naval aviation. This is far more than a story about being caught off guard. It's an examination of why 6 of Japan's finest fighter pilots, commanding the most celebrated aircraft ever to fly in the Pacific theater, could not shield the one man whose survival mattered more than any fleet, any territory, or any strategic engagement. Military historians still wrestle with the deceptively straightforward question that haunts them. How could 6 seasoned Zero pilots, hand-picked for their abilities and arranged in protective formation, fail to prevent 2 American bombers from striking their target in broad daylight? The answer reveals something deeper than simple tactical failure. It shows a convergence of technical shortcomings, strategic errors, and dangerous assumptions that would ultimately take the life of Japan's most visionary naval commander. Today we'll examine every piece of this puzzle, from the specifications of the aircraft involved to the instantaneous choices that determined Admiral Yamamoto's fate. While history typically records Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death as a victory for American intelligence and careful preparation, the Japanese perspective deserves equal examination. The 6 Zero pilots that morning have become historical footnotes, nameless fighter escorts who simply faltered. Yet these were not average pilots. They were battle-hardened veterans of the 200th Naval Air Group, men who had endured the brutal fighting above Guadalcanal, who had confronted American fighters repeatedly and survived. Their inability to complete the mission was not rooted in lack of ability or fear, but in systemic issues that weakened the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter tactics, issues that would only become clear in the intensity of that April morning. The crucial question isn't simply what occurred, but why it was permitted to occur. Why couldn't Japan's finest fighter aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M30, operated by some of the Navy's most capable aviators, accomplish what should have been a straightforward escort assignment? The explanation exists in a tangle of technical constraints, tactical weaknesses, and a fundamental misjudgment about how fighter combat had changed by 1943. The action took place just 48 hours following Operation One Go, Yamamoto's final major offensive push, when the admiral was traveling to recognize the units that participated in the campaign. At Rabaul's Lakunai airfield on the morning of April 17, 1943, the briefing room of the 200th Naval Air Group carried an unusual weight. 6 pilots were called for a special meeting, one that immediately distinguished this assignment from the monotonous patrols and emergency launches that had characterized their war experience. The chosen flyers represented experienced naval aviators. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takashi Morisaki commanded a section with over 2 years of actual combat experience. Petty Officer First Class Shuichi Sugita was an established ace carrying roughly 30 confirmed kills. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka held 20 confirmed victories and possessed tactical knowledge earned through the fiercest aerial battles above Guadalcanal. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya had received credit for 8 confirmed kills and had built a reputation for remarkable marksmanship. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsuginoe represented a veteran of solid temperament with composure under pressure, and Petty Officer Second Class Yoshushi Okazaki, though younger than his colleagues, had already demonstrated his combat capabilities. Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the 200th Air Group conveyed the briefing personally. Tomorrow, this select group of 6 would receive the supreme honor of accompanying Admiral Yamamoto himself during an inspection journey to Bougainville. The significance of this responsibility could scarcely be exaggerated. Yamamoto was far more than a naval commander. He represented the brain behind Japan's naval planning, the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, and perhaps Japan's sole military leader who possessed genuine understanding of both Japan's potential and its genuine constraints when facing America's industrial capacity. The gathered pilots grasped at once that this was no ordinary mission, but a profound responsibility of the highest order. The admiral was going to inspect installations at Balali and Buin to acknowledge the pilots who had recently finished Operation Go. What the Japanese personnel making ready their fighters at Rabaul could not suspect was that 1,600 miles distant at Pearl Harbor, American code specialists had just accomplished one of the war's greatest intelligence breakthroughs. 4 days earlier, on April 14th, multiple American signal stations detected a transmitted message from the Japanese fleet, classified NTF 131755, encrypted in the JN-25D system that American cryptographers had been progressively decoding since before the Battle of Midway. Directed to the leaders of Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla, it held something extraordinary: a comprehensive flight schedule for Admiral Yamamoto's forthcoming tour, including departure times, arrival times, and planned flight paths. At Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the decrypted material provided Yamamoto's itinerary with remarkable accuracy. Departure from Rabaul at 0600 hours, arrival at Balali Island Airfield at 800 hours, boat transportation to Shortland Island by patrol vessel at 0840, arrival at Shortland at 0940, meal break with commanding officers, departure from Shortland at 1400, return to Rabaul by 1540. The American intelligence team could hardly contain their astonishment. The Japanese, with their reputation for meticulous procedure and clockwork efficiency, had unknowingly handed over the perfect roadmap for an assassination. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had to authorize what would happen next, and after discussion with the capital, the order was issued. Yamamoto would be eliminated. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the groundwork for Operation Vengeance commenced with a demanding reality check. The journey from Guadalcanal to the attack location near Bougainville spanned 420 miles, pushing the P-38 Lightning to its absolute operational ceiling, achievable only through supplemental fuel containers and flawless navigation. Major John Mitchell, directing the 339th Fighter Squadron, spent the night of April 17th working with his planning group, determining fuel burn calculations, weather patterns, and the exact timing required to meet Yamamoto's flight at the single location where it would fall within range and remain at reduced altitude. The scheme that took shape was bold in its mathematical exactness. 18 P-38s were designated for the operation, though only 16 would participate after a pair experienced mechanical issues during launch preparations. These 16 P-38s would traverse a methodically determined path, keeping them clear of Japanese detection systems and observers, maintaining complete radio silence and flying at minimal altitude to remain hidden. The route comprised 5 carefully timed segments. Any miscalculation, any technical difficulty, any navigation mistake would doom the assignment. The planned intercept was fixed for 0935 hours, allowing the Americans merely 15 minutes of engagement before fuel reserves would compel their retreat toward home. The 6-0 pilots getting their A6M3 Model 22 fighters ready at Rabaul represented the continued development of Japan's celebrated fighter, but by April 1943, that evolution had become a disadvantage. The Zero that astonished the globe in 1940 was cutting-edge technology, a brilliant fusion of operational range, flying agility, and firepower, accomplished through radical mass reduction. Every part underwent inspection to eliminate surplus material. The airframe carried no protective structure surrounding the pilot, lacked self-sealing fuel compartments, and employed construction at bare minimum durability specifications. The outcome was a fighter of unmatched maneuverability, with an operational radius that seemed impossible for a carrier-deployed fighter. However, by 1943, this design method had become the aircraft's critical vulnerability. The A6M3 edition these pilots operated contained upgrades attempting to correct certain limitations. A more potent Sakai 21 motor, generating 1,130 horsepower, enhanced high-altitude capabilities, and improved speed in downward flight. But the essential weaknesses persisted. The Zero maintained its absence of pilot protection, persisted in storing fuel in unprotected reservoirs, transforming the aircraft into a combustible projectile when struck, and most critically for today's assignment, continued lacking the velocity to overtake or outrun the newer generation of American aircraft. the A6M3 Model 22 possessed a maximum velocity of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet. The P-38 Lightning slated to attack them tomorrow would achieve 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could descend with authority without structural concerns, and possess destructive potential sufficient to obliterate a Zero with a concentrated burst. The protection technique the Japanese prepared to execute reflected combat experience from China against less advanced opposition, not the true situation of 1943. The conventional safeguard arrangement positioned the fighters above and behind the bombers they escorted, favorable for striking downward against attackers diving from higher elevations. The conventional attack method. However, this formation held a critical weakness. It could not supply sufficient protection against strikes delivered from beneath and aft, precisely the tactic the Americans had prepared. The Zero pilots would establish position at roughly 6,500 feet, approximately 1,500 feet higher than the pair of Mitsubishi G4M Betty transports from the 705th Air Group. Transport number 323 transported Admiral Yamamoto, and vessel number 326 transported Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki alongside other personnel. Searching the heavens for danger, they anticipated descending from above, while peril climbed from underneath. As the Japanese group drew close to Bougainville at 09:30 hours, the 6-0 pilots kept their careful observation of the sky overhead and in front. This remained where they anticipated threats. Descending from brilliant sunlight, utilizing height to gain momentum for a rapid pass. Lieutenant Morisaki, commanding the escort, kept his 2 flights in proper placement per established practice, managing gaps that permitted coordinated defense while protecting the broadest possible zone of airspace. They were traversing the jungle landscape of Bougainville, the runway at Balal perceptible ahead, perhaps 5 minutes from touchdown. The segment of maximum exposure seemed nearly finished, but hazard didn't approach from the anticipated direction. At 09:34 hours, the fighter cover spotted the Japanese group precisely as expected. Pair of bombers and 6 fighters in flawless formation, completely unaware of the 16 P-38s bearing down from the southern direction at wave height. Mitsubishi Radio transmitted its initial message in over 120 minutes. Bougainville's 11 o'clock high. Captain Thomas Lanfear, heading the assault formation, stood amazed at the success. The Japanese appeared exactly on plan, positioned precisely where intelligence predicted and wholly oblivious to the threat ascending from underneath. The P-38s released their supplementary tanks and commenced their assault. What followed transpired with such velocity that participants would dispute specifics for years afterward. The Zero pilots, examining the upper sky and the ocean's horizon, didn't recognize the grayish-green P-38s ascending from beneath until they were already within firing distance. The American fighters, wearing dark olive and gray finish, merged almost imperceptibly with the jungle landscape below. Protective coloration designed specifically for the Southwest Pacific terrain proved devastatingly successful. When Petty Officer Yanagir, holding the outermost placement on the formation's right flank, finally perceived the rising P-38s and released a warning message, Lieutenant Rex Barber was already positioned 50 yards from Yamamoto's transport, his finger positioned at the firing mechanism. Barber's engagement followed textbook procedure. Approaching from the transport's lower rear quarter, in an area where the rear gunner couldn't angle weapons sufficiently for response, he activated all 4.50 caliber guns and his 20 mm of armament. The concentrated barrage tore into the Betty's right motor, right wing fuel storage, and body. In his mission report, Barber documented watching the transport's right motor commence releasing dark exhaust and white mist, petroleum and gasoline as his projectiles struck their objectives. He maintained fire as proximity decreased, adjusting his attack focus toward the right motor, observing the fuselage exterior disintegrate beneath shell impacts. Throughout the transport interior, 150 caliber round among the countless others released, penetrated the aluminum exterior and struck Admiral Yamamoto in the left upper torso, traversing through his body and departing beneath his right eye, terminating him instantly. The Zero pilots responded with the swiftness combat training provides, but intervention was already impossible. Lieutenant Morisaki flipped his fighter and executed a complete reversal, descending toward the P-38s, accompanied by his companion. Yet the geometry was hopeless, as they hovered 1,500 feet higher and further back from the engagement, a positioning that made interception unachievable. The mechanical reality of velocity and separation meant that despite pushing their fighters to maximum capacity, they lacked sufficient advantage to get between the Americans and the mortally damaged transport. Chief Petty Officer Hidaka, managing the right-side escort, banked forcefully toward Barber's P-38. But the American was already withdrawing from the fatally struck transport, employing the Lightning's superior velocity to depart before the fighters could achieve firing range. Yamamoto's transport, catastrophically wounded, pushed its nose downward toward the jungle with its right motor burning intensely. The operator, Warrant Officer Takayo Kotani, battled with determination to maintain the craft's trajectory, but with one motor destroyed and control mechanisms compromised, survival was no longer feasible. The vessel drove into the jungle at 09:38 hours, merely 4 minutes following the initial American sighting. The alternate transport, transporting Vice Admiral Ugaki, attempted escape toward open ocean but fell victim to Lieutenant Besbey Holmes, who inflicted severe trauma. This transport also descended, though Ugaki would improbably survive, recovered from the remnants with serious wounds. Only Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya delivered any meaningful resistance. While the P-38s withdrew and progressed southward toward Guadalcanal, he detected one Lightning lagging behind its companions, discharging smoke originating from one motor. This represented Lieutenant Raymond Heinz's aircraft, harmed either by return fire from the transports or throughout the engagement. The wounded Lightning streaks ahead, its damaged fuselage trailing fuel as Yanagiya closes the distance. His 20mm cannon roars, sending rounds tearing through the American fighter's wing and body. Fuel gushes from the punctured tanks, cascading through the tropical air, yet somehow the P-38 keeps flying, its single remaining engine hammering away, pulling the crippled machine towards safety. For several minutes the chase continues, the two aircraft locked in their deadly pursuit, before Yanagiya finally accepts the inevitable. He breaks away and turns back. Now he finds himself far from Bougainville, with ammunition nearly exhausted. Other P-38s might already be racing back to defend their damaged comrades. The decision is made. Yanagiya points his Zero toward Balali Airfield, where his fellow pilots from the 5 Neo have already touched down. Their aircraft sit intact and undamaged on the runway. But none of that matters anymore. The mission, their entire purpose for taking to the air, has collapsed into catastrophic failure. The American pilot guiding that crippled P-38 will never make it to Guadalcanal. Somewhere beyond the horizon, over empty water with no land in sight, the fighter disappears. Heinz is gone. One American loss. Just one. But that single victory cannot change what has happened. It cannot undo the fundamental truth. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto lies dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most brilliant strategist, the architect of their greatest triumph, has been murdered in the sky, while 6 experienced Zero pilots from the 204th Air Group were sworn to protect him. The escort mission on April 18, 1943 failed utterly, and understanding why requires examining something far deeper than any single tactical error. By 1943, an enormous technological gulf had opened between Japanese and American fighter aircraft. The Zero had been revolutionary in 1940. Its combination of range and agility had made it the finest fighter in the world. But revolutionary designs grow old. By 1943, the A6M0 was operating on borrowed time. The very philosophy that had made it dominant, that obsessive drive to reduce weight and maximize range and turning ability, had become catastrophically dangerous. That same lightweight construction meant armor protection was nearly non-existent. A single burst of machine gun fire could shred a pilot's body. The fuel tanks lacked self-sealing liners. When American bullets punctured them, they didn't just leak. They turned the aircraft into a flying firebomb, erupting into flame at the slightest spark. Speed became the critical factor for Yamamoto's escort. The Zero's maximum velocity of 338 miles per hour combined with sluggish handling at high speeds, meant it could neither pursue nor escape from what the Americans were flying now. The P-38 Lightning generated 2,800 horsepower from its twin engines, nearly 3 times the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower plant. This crushing advantage in power gave the Americans complete control over every engagement. They chose when to attack. They chose when to break away. The Japanese could only react. The defensive formation the Zeros maintained reflected tactical doctrine developed against Chinese fighters flying ancient slow aircraft in the late 1930s. Fighters positioned above and behind the bombers they escorted. This arrangement had made perfect sense once, allowing the escort to maintain altitude advantage while watching their charges. In those early days, the threat came from enemy fighters diving down from above. This tactic countered that threat effectively, but American aerial combat had evolved dramatically. The boom and zoom technique replaced the classical dogfight. High-speed passes replaced turning circles. A P-38 pilot would use his speed advantage to strike from below or behind, fire his guns, and climb away at velocities the Zero simply could not match. By the time the slower, more agile Japanese fighter could get its nose pointed at an attacker, the American was already half a mile away and climbing. The traditional Japanese defensive formation became suicide against these new tactics. Yet none of these technological mismatches truly explain the ambush's success. The real reason was simpler and far more damning. American codebreakers had shattered Japanese naval codes months earlier. The detailed itinerary Yamamoto broadcast 4 days before his flight might as well have been delivered personally to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The Japanese had never considered this possibility. Their confidence in code security was absolute, unshakable. They believed their communications impenetrable. This same overconfidence shaped every decision about the Admiral's journey. No deception, no route changes made at the last moment. No extra security measures. An Admiral would fly through active war zones exactly as planned. Nothing needed changing. No one could possibly know. At Balali Airfield, the 6 Zero pilots landed in profound silence. No one spoke of blame. No one hurled accusations of cowardice or failure. Each man understood the truth completely. They had been arranged into an ambush they could never have anticipated. Yet understanding changed nothing. These 6 pilots carried a weight that would define their remaining lives. They had been chosen for the highest honor, the greatest responsibility any pilot could receive. Protecting Admiral Yamamoto himself, and they had failed. In the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture, where shame and responsibility belonged to the group rather than individuals, all 6 pilots knew their entire existence had been transformed by this single catastrophic defeat. At Rabaul, the news struck like a physical blow. The Admiral was far more than a commander. He embodied the dreams of the entire Japanese Navy, the sole leader who truly grasped both Japan's enormous strengths and its terrifying limitations. His death meant something beyond strategy and tactics. It represented a psychological shattering. Morale, already worn down by months of brutal fighting across the Solomon Islands, collapsed further. Officers at Rabaul moved like sleepwalkers. The Japanese High Command immediately sealed all details as top secret. The public would not learn the truth until May 21, 1943, and even then they received only sanitized information. The Admiral had died directing operations at the front. That was all Japan needed to know. On June 5, 1943, the nation mourned. A state funeral was held in Tokyo for Admiral Yamamoto, an honor reserved for the nation's greatest heroes. The Emperor himself attended. The entire country observed a moment of silence. For the 6 Zero pilots at Rabaul, the ceremony represented official acknowledgement of their catastrophic failure. 2 days after Yamamoto's funeral, on June 7th, the Japanese Navy struck back with overwhelming force. 81 Zeros roared into the air, 12 carrying incendiary bombs, the rest providing escort. All were from the 204th Air Group. The target was Allied positions in the Solomon Islands, specifically the Russell Islands. The raid was meant to demonstrate strength, to show that Japan could still hit hard. During that brutal 90-minute battle, 2 of Yamamoto's original escort pilots were shot down and killed. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka died in the savage fighting that claimed 23 to 24 Japanese aircraft against approximately 50 Allied fighters. Petty Officer Second Class Yoshushi Okazaki also fell during the same engagement. Both men had been carrying firebombs beneath their wings, pressing their attacks through withering anti-aircraft fire. Their deaths marked the beginning of a pattern. The Yamamoto escorts were seeking redemption through combat, through blood and victory. But Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya's war took a different turn that same day. After releasing his bombs on Russell Island, two F-4F Wildcats caught him in a climbing turn. No escape seemed possible. Desperate evasive maneuvers failed. American .50 caliber rounds slammed into his cockpit with sickening force. One bullet smashed through his right hand as it gripped the control stick. His hand was nearly destroyed, only his small finger still attached. Another round tore through his right leg, severing blood vessels. His boot immediately filled with blood. Yet somehow, through shock and agony, Yanagiya held consciousness. Using only his left hand, shouting to keep himself awake against the creeping darkness, he flew his shattered Zero back to Munda Base. Unable to lower the landing gear with his destroyed right hand, he belly landed on the coral runway, the aircraft skidding and shrieking. Japanese Marines pulled him from the smoking cockpit, barely alive. What remained of his right hand was amputated immediately. Against every medical expectation, he survived. He was evacuated to Japan. His war had ended, but his life had been spared. On June 16, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, the original escort flight leader, was killed while attacking Allied transports near Guadalcanal. He died alongside squadron leader Jiro Miyano during another raid against American shipping. Just 9 days after Hidaka and Okazaki's deaths, Morisaki was gone. Now only 2 of the original 6 escorts remained in combat. On July 1, 1943, Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsuginoe vanished during an escort mission for dive bombers attacking the Allied anchorage at Rendova Island. He was never seen again. His fate remained unknown. With Tsuginoe's disappearance, only one member of the original escort continued flying. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita. Sugita had already accumulated approximately 30 confirmed victories when Yamamoto was killed. He chose a different path to redemption than his fallen comrades. Rather than seeking glorious death, he decided that destroying American aircraft would better atone for their mission's failure than dying in a single moment of combat. Throughout the summer of 1943, Sugita steadily added to his score across the Solomon Islands skies. By August, his tally had reached approximately 40 victories. He was now the leading ace in the entire Solomon Islands campaign. But in August 1943, his first brush with death arrived. An American fighter patrol caught his Zero while he was attacking bombers. His engine took hits and burst into flame. In an action many Japanese pilots would consider shameful, Sugita bailed out of his burning fighter, parachuting toward Japanese-held territory with severe burns covering his body. After treatment, he was evacuated to Japan. Recovery would take 7 months. By March 1944, Sugita returned to combat as a petty officer second class with the 263rd Air Group in Guam. The Pacific War had transformed completely during his absence. The Americans had seized the Marshall Islands, neutralized Truk, and were preparing to invade the Mariana Islands. The war's balance had shifted decisively. In June 1944, his unit merged with the 201st Air Group in the Philippines, which was reorganized as the Navy's first official kamikaze unit under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. Sugita refused kamikaze missions and was ordered back to Japan. In June 1944, Sugita participated in what the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the massive aerial battle that accompanied the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, Japanese naval aviation launched its largest carrier operation since Midway. The result was total catastrophe. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns obliterated over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day of combat. Sugita survived as his unit, the 263rd Air Group, was essentially wiped from existence. 6 aircraft attempted to escape to Guam. F-6F Hellcats ambushed them. 5 were shot down immediately. Sugita Zero, struck repeatedly with its navigation equipment destroyed, somehow reached a Japanese base on Rota. He was the sole survivor of his entire unit. By January 1945, now promoted to Chief Petty Officer, Sugita joined the elite 301st Fighter Squadron of the 343rd Naval Air Group at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. His official record showed 70 confirmed victories. Nearly 2 years had passed since Admiral Yamamoto's death. On April 15, 1945, American carrier aircraft descended on Kanoya. The Grumman Hellcats screamed down from above, fighters from the USS Independence and USS Randolph diving on the scattered formation. Sugita's beautiful Kawanishi Shiden Kai fighter was struck just as his wheels left the runway, the aircraft spiraling violently before crashing beyond the airfield's edge. He was gone instantly at age 20, having outlasted every other pilot who'd flown escort for Admiral Yamamoto that morning, yet he would never find the redemption he craved. Back in Japan, Kenji Yanagiya began his slow, painful recovery from wounds sustained on June 7, 1943. The loss of his right hand meant one certainty: he would never return to combat. Promoted to warrant officer and reassigned to Kasumi Gaijin Naval Air Station, he spent the war's remaining years teaching the next generation of pilots, passing on what knowledge he possessed to recruits who would face the same impossible odds. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yanagiya found himself among roughly 5,000 surviving naval aviators. Of the more than 25,000 pilots who had served throughout the war, he was among the fortunate few who remained alive. He returned to Tokyo and secured work with a modest trading company. For nearly 30 years, he kept silent about his role in the Yamamoto mission, carrying the weight of being the sole survivor from that fateful escort. The knowledge that he alone remained haunted him quietly. It was a private sorrow he could never share with anyone. During the mid-1970s, Japanese aviation historian Akira Yoshimura began researching a comprehensive book about the Yamamoto mission. Through painstaking investigation, he uncovered a remarkable fact: one escort pilot had survived the entire war. He eventually located Yanagiya, now in his 50s, working somewhere in Tokyo's bustling streets. Through a series of detailed interviews, Yanagiya's account finally emerged, breaking decades of silence. He described the selection process and the enormous pride of being chosen. He recounted the formation above Bougainville, the overwhelming shock of the American assault, and the impossible mathematics of defense. For the first time, the world heard the Japanese perspective on why the mission had failed. Yanagiya explained how the P-38s emerged from an angle no one expected, appearing exactly when doctrine said they shouldn't. He detailed how the Zero escort had been positioned according to established procedures that proved catastrophically inadequate against American tactics. The American fighters possessed superior speed and executed their attack with devastating precision. He emphasized repeatedly that 6 Zero fighters could not possibly defend 2 bombers against 16 P-38s. The numbers were simply stacked against them from the beginning. Between April 15 and 17, 1988, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, organized a commemorative symposium marking the 45th anniversary of the operation. 8 surviving American pilots who had participated in the mission made the journey to attend. Through Japanese contacts, they extended an unprecedented invitation to Yanagiya. At age 68, he accepted, making his first journey to America to meet the men who had killed his commander and his comrades. Newspaper accounts from the time recorded the moment. A lone Japanese attendee, former Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, sat among American veterans for the first time since wartime enemies faced each other across Pacific skies. During the symposium, Yanagiya encountered mission leader John Mitchell and presented him with a simple handheld compass. He shook hands with Rex Barber and other American pilots who had been there that morning. An official oral history recording was made on April 15, 1988, now preserved in Texas archives for future generations. Video cameras captured panel discussions featuring Yanagiya alongside American pilots, including Frank Holmes, Louis Kittle, Jack Jacobson, Douglas Canning, and Roger Ames. Over the next 2 decades, Yanagiya appeared in numerous interviews and documentaries, telling his story repeatedly. He maintained consistently that protecting Yamamoto had been essentially impossible given the circumstances. Aircraft that were already becoming obsolete, tactical doctrine that hadn't evolved, and an enemy possessing perfect intelligence about when and where to strike. Kenji Yanagiya died on February 29, 2008 at age 88, the final living witness to one of the Pacific War's most pivotal moments. The failure to protect Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, was ultimately rooted not in the courage or skill of those involved, but in technological realities and intelligence failures. The Zero, revolutionary in 1940, had become dangerously outdated by 1943. Its thin skin offered no real protection. The fuel tanks couldn't seal themselves against damage. Most critically, it simply couldn't match American speed. The P-38 Lightning possessed the ability to attack and withdraw whenever its pilots chose, dictating every aspect of the engagement in ways that completely negated the Zero's superior turning ability. The A6M3 Model 22 reached a maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet, while the P-38 managed 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Lightning's twin Allison engines generated between 2,800 and 3,450 combined horsepower. By contrast, the Zero's single Sakai engine produced barely 1,130 horsepower. The American fighter climbed 1,650 feet per minute faster and maintained superior performance above 20,000 feet, thanks to turbo superchargers that the Japanese aircraft lacked. At altitude, there was simply no contest. The breaking of the JN-25D cipher represented one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in military history. Japan's detailed message outlining Yamamoto's exact itinerary provided American forces with everything necessary for the interception. The Japanese Navy had broadcast the information across multiple commands as part of routine Operation Ego coordination, specifying precise times and locations. This intelligence advantage was amplified by Japanese confidence in their code security and their failure to implement even basic operational security. The Japanese Navy couldn't conceive that their codes had been compromised. Even after Yamamoto's death, some officers suspected the Americans had received a warning, but Navy leadership flatly rejected any possibility that JN-25D had been broken. This stubborn refusal to acknowledge the danger allowed American codebreakers to continue reading Japanese communications for months afterward, gleaning invaluable information about fleet movements and strategic intentions. The positioning of the escort reflected tactics developed during campaigns against inferior Chinese forces in the late 1930s. Doctrine dictated that attacks would come from above. The spacing between aircraft prevented them from supporting one another effectively. The altitude differential made rapid response impossible. All these factors contributed to the disaster. The 6-0 pilots flew in two V-shaped formations of 3 aircraft each, positioned at approximately 6,500 feet, roughly 1,500 feet above and behind the 2 Betty bombers. Japanese fighter doctrine celebrated individual piloting skill above coordinated teamwork. While American pilots trained relentlessly in mutual support techniques like the thatch weave, Japanese flyers were expected to triumph through superior airmanship. This philosophy had worked when Japanese pilots possessed advantages in both aircraft quality and experience. But by 1943, American pilots were increasingly well-trained and flying aircraft that outperformed Japanese planes in almost every category. The 6-0 pilots escorting Yamamoto that morning discovered they were flying into a tactical and technological trap from which there was no escape. The failure would define the remainder of each pilot's life. Within 3 months, 4 were dead. Hidaka and Okazaki fell on June 7th. Morisaki died on June 16th. Tsuginoe vanished on July 1st. Shochi Sugita survived until April 15, 1945, accumulating 70 official victories before perishing during a takeoff scramble at Kanohe. Only Kenji Yanagiya lived through the war, carrying the burden of failure until his own death in 2008. The 204th Air Group, from which all 6 escort pilots came, endured severe losses throughout 1943. The unit had been established on November 1, 1942, by renaming the 6th Air Group and was based at Rabaul during the Solomon Islands campaign. By war's end, virtually none of its original pilots had survived. Yamamoto's death struck Japan a blow from which the nation never truly recovered. He was far more than a fleet commander. He was the intellectual author of Japanese naval strategy. His understanding of American industrial capacity, his warnings about the dangers of prolonged war, and his imaginative conception of operations like Pearl Harbor made him irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Menechi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and personal magnetism. For the Americans, the successful operation validated their intelligence capabilities and demonstrated their growing capacity to execute complex long-range missions. The operation became a template for similar ventures throughout the Pacific War. 18 P-38s were originally assigned to Operation Vengeance, though only 16 actually launched after 2 developed mechanical difficulties during startup. The failure to protect Yamamoto was not a failure of the 6 escort pilots, but rather a failure of the entire Japanese military system by 1943. It represents the precise moment when individual courage and piloting skill could no longer overcome technological and intelligence disadvantages. The Zero pilots executed everything their training and doctrine demanded, but that very training and doctrine were fundamentally flawed. Could a different escort positioning have saved Yamamoto? The honest answer is almost certainly not. Even if the Zeros had detected the P-38 seconds earlier, even if positioned lower, the speed and firepower superiority of American fighters was overwhelming. The P-38s needed only moments to destroy the unarmored Betty bombers. The Zeros might have made the attack costlier, but they could not have prevented it. The story of why Japanese pilots failed to protect Admiral Yamamoto transcends a single mission gone wrong. It serves as a perfect miniature of Japan's larger defeat in the Pacific War, demonstrating how technological superiority, intelligence advantage, and tactical innovation can overwhelm the traditional military virtues of courage, skill, and dedication. The 6 Zero pilots represented experienced naval aviation, but by April 1943, experience alone was no longer sufficient. The mission culminated Operation Ego, Yamamoto's final offensive that claimed to have sunk 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports while destroying 175 Allied aircraft. Actual Allied losses totaled approximately 25 aircraft and several ships. The operation had concentrated 350 aircraft, including carrier planes from Zuikaku, Zuiho, Junyo, and Hiyu, conducting strikes between April 1st and 16th, 1943. Japanese losses totaled 55 aircraft. Yamamoto was flying to congratulate the units that had participated in Operation Ego. When American intelligence, having broken JN-25, learned his exact itinerary, the trap was set. The precision of American planning proved remarkable. 16 P-38s, navigating 420 miles in complete radio silence to arrive at exactly 9:35 in the morning, represents the evolution of American military capabilities by 1943. The wreckage of Betty Bomber No. 323 still rests in the Bougainville jungle, a permanent monument to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. The 6 Zero pilots who failed to protect him are remembered chiefly through Yanagiya's testimony. Their failure deserves thoughtful consideration, for it encapsulates the tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War. Skilled warriors undone by technological inferiority, doctrinal rigidity, and intelligence failures. Kenji Yanagiya died on February 29, 2008, at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. With his passing, the story of the Yamamoto escort transitioned from living memory into history. The lessons, however, remain urgent. The danger of technological complacency, the critical importance of intelligence security, the necessity of doctrine evolving with changing circumstances, and ultimately the limits of human courage when facing systematic disadvantage. The 6 Zero pilots who flew on April 18, 1943, were not failures. They were men asked to accomplish the impossible, and their inability to achieve it marked not their inadequacy, but the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. They flew outdated aircraft, followed obsolete doctrine, and faced an enemy who possessed complete knowledge of their plans. Their story represents one of the Pacific War's most poignant tragedies. Warriors defeated not by lack of courage, but by the fundamental transformation of warfare itself.